Good to see you all here. Welcome. So I hope you're all caffeinated up because it's going to be a pretty big day. So for those who don't know me, I am Rick Ledigo. I am the chair of the Australian Dairy Industry Council, as well as I am a dairy farmer in the Adelaide Hills as well. So I know that side of it. So first of all, it's going to be a big day. It's great to see so many people here. There's roughly 100 odd people involved and some will be online as well. So for the first session. Beyond that, so firstly, just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and their connection to the land, water and communities, and pay our respects to the elders past and present. From the Australian Dairy Industry Sustainability Framework, it is a fantastic piece that the dairy industry's been doing now for just over 10 years, and you'll see on your tables, you've got the 10-year report, which I've got to say, as a dairy farmer, I'm really, really proud of that paperwork. And if you haven't got one, take one. And if you've got one, take another one and give it to a parliamentarian or someone like that as well, because I think it's a fantastic report of what we've been doing for over 10 years. And part of that is the fact that we were the first industry basically in the world to get to it and put this together and start a sustainability framework. There's even in, I know sheep meat have only just done theirs in Australia. So we're that far ahead already in dairy. So to be sitting here today and go, we've already done 10 years, now let's look at the future. I think that's pretty fantastic as an industry. So what I did do is I Googled sustainability this morning because it's become such a catchword. And the interesting part is on Google, because Google knows everything, is that it showed a graph of sustainability as a word, as into how it's been used. And it actually was really, it's this flat line till about, I'm guessing probably 2010-ish, it suddenly does that. Just it leaps ahead. So obviously this is a pretty big word in the world in the world now of sustainability. And having been to France just recently, they're also really keen on what sustainability, and they're looking at what we do. And when we do free trade agreements, we're all talking sustainability, and they want to have restrictions on us if we don't match them, etc. And we probably don't do the same, but it's certainly a big catch cry in the world. So sustainability, according to Google, its definition is sustainability consists of fulfilling the needs of current generations without compromising the needs of future generations, while ensuring a balance between economic growth, environmental care, and social well-being. So I thought that's probably covers it pretty well. So I think that's a good basis for today when we work through the agenda that we have. So you probably don't want to sit and listen to me all day because I'm not going to tell you a lot more, because there's some really good people that are along today that are going to be speaking, etc. So first of all, I'll welcome David Nation, who's the Managing Director of Dairy Australia. Dairy Australia is a vital partner in the development and implementation of the framework, and it also provides support as a secretariat for the framework. So welcome, David.
It kind of reminds me of the footballer after the Dreamtime game the other day. I don't know if you saw the awards afterwards, and he's down leaning like this trying to receive his award. So trying to avoid that today a bit, I reckon. Anyway, thanks, Rick, and thanks for the welcome. And I think it's so important that Rick spoke first today, because I think the most powerful thing about the Australian dairy industry sustainability framework is that it's owned by the whole industry. It's owned by peak farming groups and peak processing groups, peak marketing groups, side by side. That's the single most important thing about the framework. The whole industry owns it. The whole industry stands behind it. And then from my perspective, in my role as Managing Director of Dairy Australia, our pride is in supporting it. Our pride is in servicing the framework. Our pride is in challenging the framework. Our pride is in working out how far we can take our 4 commitments, how far we can pursue all of the targets in the sustainability framework. And our pride is in saying, this work will never be done. This is an ongoing, constant challenge to say, what is the expectations of the whole supply chain? What do we need to do? So I think more than anything else, that encapsulates where we're going to try and take this first session today, to really pitch forwards. It's fantastic, as Rick said, that there's a 10-year anniversary document on your tables, because the framework has come a long way in 10 years. The framework started out with targets to hit for 2020. The framework now speaks to targets to hit for 2030. And that's the way we'll continue to refresh, to rethink, to take things forward. So the way today is going to work is we'll start with a plenary, and we'll start with a panel session of some fantastic people to get perspectives from. And then that will hopefully get all of us thinking, so that when we get to having roundtable discussions, we've really got some great thinking, great sort of ways of challenging ourselves to get the most out of us being all here together. Because the other thing about this here today is this is the first time we've had a chance to get face to face for a long time to talk about sustainability, for reasons that we all understand. And it's great as well in this modern age that we're hybrid as well. So I'd like to welcome everyone who's online, because these days you can do it both, and we will. So without further ado, with that as the format that we're going to launch into, I'd like to start by introducing the man who's going to try and stretch us this morning. His name's Paul Higgins. He's from EmergentFutures, and he's a futurist. He's worked in strategic foresight consulting for 20 years and is a graduate of Swinburne University's Strategic Foresight Masters program. But I think as much as anything, I'm really looking forward to Paul talking to us today, because I think Paul really gets agriculture, and not just one industry, but multiple industries. So it's fantastic to have a voice like Paul's to start the day. And I'd like to start by welcoming you up here, Paul. Thanks very much.
Thanks, David. Could I just get those slides up, please? While it's happening, I have more than a passing interest in the dairy industry. No, that's not the slides. I used to be, in the long distance past, before some of you were born, I was a dairy cattle veterinarian. And more recently, my brother has become CEO of Yarra Valley Dairy. Both from a family perspective and a history, I have some interest in that. So I'm going to talk today on some scenarios for the future of sustainable food. I'm going to stay away from some of the detail, which some of the other panelists will cover off on. And this is basically what I'm going to try to do today. Excuse me for a moment. So I'm going to do a short introduction about scenario thinking. I'm going to present a short framework, because I want to put inside your heads that framework so those scenarios make more sense to you. Then I'm going to do the 4 scenarios that are up there. I won't explain them at this point, but hopefully they're interesting from the point of view of the future of sustainable food. So just first of all, my intent here is that in 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, 2 years' time, you're able to take what I've spoken about today, and you're sitting around your kitchen table, your board table, wherever you may be, and you can use that to think about what the future might look like at that point as well. So I'm not going to try and do, and futurists shouldn't do, predictions. I'm more going to talk about what drives these scenarios. So when you're sitting around that table in a year's time or whatever that may be, you can look at those things and go, well, you know, that futurist said this, but this has changed and that's changed. So now the picture might be this rather than that. So you can think about your strategy. And so as an example of that, this is something I published in The Age, the story down the bottom there a while ago, it's 2006, on the future of oil. And basically the story was, you know, oil was $140 a barrel US, I think at the time. Everyone was saying it was going to 200. And I wrote an article saying I'm happy to bet someone that it will be under $40 within a certain period of time. Now, there's 2 things about that. One is it was a bet, which means I was saying there's more than a 50% chance that will be correct, not that it's actually going to happen. And secondly, what I did was list out, if you read the article, the drivers, the things that I thought were going to happen that were going to create that outcome. So it wasn't the outcome that was important, it was the description of the logical, coherent story that was in that article. So that's what I'm going to try and do today around those 4 scenarios, so you can take some of those drivers away with you. And a scenario is an accurate, within the context of those drivers, but not necessarily truthful story about the future. And additionally, from the same Futurist, any useful idea should appear to be ridiculous. So a couple of the things I'm going to talk about today, you will think are ridiculous, I hope. Otherwise, I haven't done my job. But you should sort of think about them and go, well, what if they really did happen? What would that mean? What are the underlying drivers which creates that story? What might that mean to us in the future? 3 quick things before I go on to the main part of this. First of all, this presentation's got a few links in it and things. We'll make that available after the session anyway. So don't feel if you're interested in something, you have to scribble down the web address or whatever. Secondly, it's not supposed to be a lecture, so I've got about 40 minutes in total, but I'm happy to be interrupted. So if you want to do that while I'm talking rather than wait to the end, then please do so. And just to prove I'm serious about that, I brought some prizes for the best argument against anything I say and the best question. And David's going to judge those. They won't be given out until after the panel session's finished, so you've got a chance to ask and argue with the panelists as well. And what they are is, I'm not sure if you've seen this story, but the FBI has issued this warning that if you plug your mobile phone into a charger socket, people are modifying charger sockets in public places so that they can steal your data through the PowerPoint. Because the USB cable you use on your charger is a data as well as a power generation transfer system. So they can siphon your data off while you're trying to charge your phone. So I have a couple here, they're still in the packet to prove that I haven't created something which is illegal and going to steal your data anyway for me. A couple of those for blockers, which you can insert into your charger cable and stop that happening when you're travelling and charging at airports or cafes or wherever you may want to be. Now, normally in a room this size, people can point to the person in the room who will be the most argumentative. Is there any takers for that? Or Ian over here has already been pointed out by Helen. That was before I started, so yeah. Anyway, please go for your life in terms of arguing with me and interrupting me. So first of all, I just want to talk about one of the frameworks we use for thinking about the future. It was created, it's called Wardley Mapping, and it was created by this guy, Simon Wardley, who says he's not very good at marketing, so he just calls it Wardley Mapping after his own name. And he just gives it all away for free. So if you're interested in the framework, you can follow him and you can see how it works and you can use it yourself. There's a whole lot of support online for that and it's not charged for. So that's part of the reason I put it up. And what it is a map like this that says you can map a business model or an industry landscape using those that map and those 4 key factors. If you look at those, the top line there where it goes Genesis, custom built, product and commodity, that's about technology. So going from the invention to where they become commoditized. In the case of the bottom line, it's about practices. So what are business practices, what are industry practices, moving from novel, emerging, good to best. Now you can also use this for social values. So what's happening to people's attitudes, which obviously around sustainability is a big thing in terms of novel attitudes, divergent, converging, and then agreed. So if you think around some of the things that you talk now about sustainability, if you went back and talked in the dairy industry when I was a dairy cattle veterinarian, I'm just trying to do the numbers in my head, 39 years ago when I started, some of the things which you think are reasonable agreed now, the industry would not have agreed on back in 39 years ago. Now, I think it's a little bit of a fool's errand to try and go, what will those things, how will they emerge and how will they look in 20 years' time? So I'm just going to primarily concentrate today on the technology part in terms of what is moving towards the right of that graph or that map. And the reason why moving to the right is important is when technologies move from that novel phase all the way over to the commodity phase, they have changed characteristics. They go from highly risky to low risk. They go from expensive to cheap. They go from narrow adoption to wide adoption. And what happens is people's business practices and behaviours evolve, co-evolve with those changes. So if you can think about how those technologies are moving, then you can start to think about how people's behaviours and business practices might change along with them. So if you can keep that in mind when I'm talking about 3 of these scenarios, not 4 of them, but 3 of them, that will give you some idea about how I've come to some of these views. So let's get into 4 scenarios. The first of those is a new age, a new age of misinformation and disinformation. Now, some of you may already think we've already been in that age, given this fellow, but we're moving towards, in my view, a new age of misinformation and disinformation. So if you look around the media for the last couple of months, you can pick up lots and lots of stories around generative AI models, ChatGPT, etc. These are 4 that I just plucked out of our scanning database in the last couple of days. So you can run them on your iPhone now. AI stories about, all the stories has been about kids cheating and education and tests and things, but there are opportunities there as well. Bloomberg has introduced one built on all its financial data system that's actually not built on the internet, but also in its internal data systems. And there's all sorts of issues around cybersecurity because some of these systems are getting quite good at writing code that's executable from the start. Now, if we talk about generative large language models, what they're essentially doing is they are creating natural language or seeming naturally language systems. But if you read this article by Stephen Wolfram, who's a brilliant mathematician, he said essentially this is what they're doing. So they're not creating novel content from scratch. What they're doing is they're looking at the question or prompt that you put in there, and they're going, of all the things that have been written on the database or the internet that I've been given access to, the GPT has been given access to, what does an answer look like to a question which looks like yours? And just going, what's the next word I should put in there? So what that does is it creates a very rapid and very plausible sounding piece of text. We're seeing all sorts of applications being built on top of this. And what's likely is we're going to end up with probably 3 or 4 major technology stacks with lots of people building sort of commodity-based applications on top. Now, if we add in a couple of other things on top of that, so if we add in deep fake videos, which you'll have seen around the internet over the last period of time, but we can also add in fake voices. Now, David, last night I thought I might take some of the audio I had of you speaking, but I didn't. But I didn't have enough time, is the truth, but I could have done this. But what I did is I did a very quick 1-pass clone of my own voice, giving part of the rest of the presentation.
So putting aside all the hype about them, this is what they're really good at. It also makes them seem plausible to us as human beings because we are hardwired to respond to the sort of language that they produce, which give an impression of intelligence. And a huge number of companies are putting them inside their existing tools to help you write, summarize, and create presentations. We're also seeing developments in a very short period that can run these models with much smaller computing capacity, even your phone. If we add in the ability to easily produce deepfake videos, then what we have is a low-cost distributed way to produce lots of more and more plausible sounding content. Think spam emails that do not have weird grammar or spelling errors. This low cost and distributed capacity exposes the industry to a fire hose of falsehoods that are designed to flood the information space with so much stuff that nobody can work out what is true and what is not true, causing cognitive exhaustion.
So clearly that doesn't sound exactly like me, but that was done in 90 seconds. And I asked it to put a slight English accent over my voice so that someone couldn't steal that one and make a clone of me and go on to other things. But what that means is these technologies, if you think back to that map I put up, or that, commoditization of technologies, are pushing to a distributed, so can run them on your phone, can run them on any computer, very low cost. Essentially, that's a professional system I use for that, but it only costs $5 a month to run 10,000 systems or 10,000 clones. So what we're likely to see is this huge amount of just false information, disinformation. So if I plug GPT into that, I wrote that text myself, so that was part of the outline I did for this presentation. But if I plug GPT into that and ask it to produce 1,000 different variations on, cheese is killing you, or whatever that may be, put it into there and use 75 clone voices, etc., use authoritative voices, add that to video, etc., then we're likely to see lots and lots of false information, disinformation in this space. And the question that raises is, how do customers decide who to trust? Because you may have the best sustainability framework in the world for agriculture, and you may be doing a great job at executing and implementing it. But if the consumer cannot tell what's real and what is not, how are they going to decide whether they're about what's going on? So you can imagine, Peter and other organisations using these sort of things as an activist tool, basically just to flood the space. They don't have to be right. They don't have to be accurate. They just have to sow enough distrust that people do not know what is real and what is not. So that is one scenario I think you should be thinking about in terms of how you respond to those sort of things, and who is the trusted voice. How do you do that in that sort of information space? So the next scenario is Australia is the new Italy. This could go a couple of ways, but this is politics. So a question for you. How many governments has Italy had since 1945? 48? Anybody else want to crack? I'll give you a clue. 48's not enough. That's too many. Well, I won't play higher or lower. It's 69. Italy has had an average of a new government every 1.11 years since World War II. Now you think, the coalitions keep reforming, etc. How does that apply to Australia? That number is the primary vote of the two major parties in 1983. That number is the primary vote of the two major parties in Australia last year. Now, that's been going on for a long time. If you look at this graph, the green line at the bottom is the House vote. And, you can go back to sort of mid-70s and probably you put a trend line through that. It's going up, it's gone up and down, but generally the trend is in that direction. That last figure is 21% of non-major party votes in the federal parliament in the lower house. If I go back to that number there. So from that 2013, from 2013 to 2022, that number has gone from 21.1% to almost 32% of non-primary vote. If that trend continues, we've got a fair chance of becoming Italy. And I think there's a plausible scenario that we might end up with permanent minority governments here in Australia. At the moment, the coalition federally has to win 18 seats to get a 1-seat majority. Now, if you think about what that might look like, what's a very plausible scenario, I think, is that looks like either major side of politics having to form some sort of coalition government with maybe a moving coalition of a combination of Greens and Teal independents. If that happens, what does that mean for the regulatory environment that you face? Because if a Labor government or a coalition government, sorry, I'm mixing up my coalitions here, a Liberal national government in a coalition with other parties is forced to take positions which are more socially progressive in particular than their sort of core vote, central vote, what does that mean? What does it mean for attitudes to and regulation to climate change if that happens and we see an accelerated change in public opinion? So Australia being the new Italy, I think, is really possible over the next 10 years. And you should think about what that means for the regulatory environment that the dairy industry faces, because I think there's a very large chance that you may be facing a far deeper regulatory and political scrutiny of the sustainability framework and the industry in that context. The third one is automation concentrates the mind. So we've seen during the pandemic, there was a great acceleration, obviously, in terms of e-commerce. What's tended to happen is that was more a drag forward process rather than a acceleration process. So people who were going to move to more e-commerce in the next 2 or 3 years did it straight away, but there's a sort of a hole in that sort of thing, so it goes back to the trend line. Obviously, cold chain e-commerce is more tricky and difficult in that environment just because of the cold chain issues. But we have seen, particularly like Amazon Fresh, for example, in the UK, be quite successful in terms of cold chain management, in terms of automation of e-commerce and delivery. The major supermarkets obviously are involved in, and this is the Coles example, in relation to Ocado, so involved in large spend of automation of their back end, so automation of the warehousing and delivery process. And quite a lot of analysis went on during the pandemic that said basically unless you can automate that process, it's unprofitable. You can't run it as a long term as a pick and, in supermarkets and all that sort of thing. It just costs too much money, more than people are prepared to pay. We obviously got currently things like these, which is subscribe and save again on Amazon. So you can set up that you're going to order various stuff and it will just arrive. So I do that for quite a lot of our household goods, particularly bulky things like dog food, dishwasher tablets, cereal, a few other things. That's available now. There's a significant discount. I don't have to pick the things up. It works quite well. It's cheaper than I can buy it in the supermarket. On top of that, we're seeing developments, if we go back to the AI side of things, about things like this. So predictive AI, so I should say, I always get in trouble doing this in agriculture, artificial intelligence systems being put together that says you can, this one is about, well, you know, we'll help you pick recipes to cook. Then we can create a shopping list for that, which will automatically get it delivered to your house. So you don't have to worry about anything about shopping or ordering, etc. Now, it's a fairly easy, I'll say relatively easy step from that to go, if I have a ordering system for food and an artificial intelligence system can look at all of the things that I've done in terms of what I've cooked at home, what my ordering pattern is, where I get it from, then it can put together a weekly shopping list for me with recipe recommendations, automate the process of ordering it, and stuff will just arrive at my house and I will never go near a supermarket again. Now, what's interesting there is not any of the technology. What is interesting is the behavior. So, and this is a little bit sexist, but it sort of illustrates the issue. There's a big difference between someone doing a subscribe and save or automating their purchasing flow to a harried mother with 2 children hanging off the shopping cart at a supermarket, both in terms of the time pressures, the availability of information, because, you know, if you're talking about only labels, you've only got the label size to provide information. And if I'm going to set and forget my ordering for a certain product and forget about it for a year or 2 years, then I'm much more likely to go, I'd like a little bit more information about that before I make that decision. Now, if I marry that up and go back to the disinformation, misinformation system, how does that work? How do I trust the products? Will we see an emergence of, again, artificial intelligence generated systems that act as my agent to do investigations? Do we end up with an application built on top of those generative LLM models to go, please tell me all of the things you can find out about the sustainability of this cheese product? Now, again, I've got to then differentiate between how do we go about differentiating what's real and not real. But I think that what we'll see is more developments in this space and therefore more and more attention placed on information from the supply chain in relation to sustainability issues, because changing the flow of how people do things and changing the decision point at where they do that changes the whole system in terms of data, information flows, and how much they're prepared to look at that stuff. Now I'm going to move more to one of my when I said at the start that I was going to do something which was a little bit ridiculous. Here's where I do that. It has some basis in fact, but also has a level of ridiculousness. That's Green Atlas. Is anybody familiar with Green Atlas? No? So Green Atlas is a company out of Sydney that has built a vision system that you can strap to the back of an ATV, drive up and down your orchards, in this case almonds, but you can do it for all sorts of orchards, and it will give you high quality vision of every individual tree on your farm to allow decision making at a farm level. Now, they put some money in originally. They've never had to raise any other money because they've been able to sell that product at a commercial value and generate profits from that by just it purely being a farmer decision-making tool. What they have found is that while that is true, they're now making more money about data and information supply up and down the supply chain. So a whole lot of predictive work, a whole lot of data to suppliers in terms of environmental and spraying things, warehouse capacity requirements, packaging, printing and programming, etc., based on volume, a whole range of things like that. So the reason I put that up is there's a model here that says if you can produce a commercial decision-making tool for farmers that they will buy and pay for that's profitable, then that will get relatively rapid adoption, and these guys have got that. But what you're doing when you do that is you're building on farm an information platform on top of that system. So if we move down to, again, we talk about the next 10 years, then if you think about things like smart tags for animals, if we think about much more cheaper and farm side genetic testing, we look at facial recognition for cattle, which is already in place now, then we can get to the point where those information platforms are providing a lot of information about what's going on farm. So the other three scenarios I've talked about are really about sort of consumers and down the track. This is about on farm to an extent, but it has some other implications, I think. It does two things. One is, if you look at those other scenarios, if we've got regulators, if we've got consumers having both the capacity and the enablers to ask for more data, and on the other end of the supply chain, the farmers producing platforms that will give more data, then the supply chain in the middle is going to be going, well, we want that data because we're going to want to supply that to our customers. And I know that there's a differentiation here between value-added customers and commodity customers, but as long as enough value-added customers want this sort of information, that will become part of the ecosystem, because it's very hard to differentiate or separate product between those two streams. Now, the other thing it does is individualization. So if you look at that Green Atlas example, I've now got data on every single individual tree. You can extrapolate forward to that to say, why can't David and I be almond farmers by owning 10,000 trees on 65 different farms in 4 different continents and 7 different countries? Because I can run, in theory, an individual profit and loss on every single one of those trees, because I know what their yields are, I know what their inputs are, and I can actually buy that individual tree. So here's my ridiculous part. We're going to see dairy farmer fantasy leagues, just like the football fantasy leagues. And while I may say this is a bit ridiculous, I think there's a possibility that if this happens, it can change some of the structure of the industry. And what I mean by that is, one of the big issues right across agriculture we've got, of course, is aging of the aging farmers, essentially, and younger farmers or people who want to enter the industry having a lot of trouble accessing capital. Now, if you can individualize the animal or individualize the tree and separate it away from the land asset, can you produce an economic model where young farmers who have good performance relative to others can raise capital through the financial markets? Now, there's a downside to these things as well, because where there's money, there's always corruption. So if this happened, there's a very strong possibility you might see performance-enhancing drugs for cows, because if I can land that next financing round by boosting my production this year, maybe I can cheat on some of those things. You also will likely see the financialization of a whole load of these things. So it's not just a matter of David and I owning those trees, but we could trade those trees. We can have derivatives on those trees. We can have a whole range of things. So it brings a new context into that social and economic sustainability for the industry if that happens. So just to finish, when I was working through these issues and thinking about them, what tied them together was really about increased transparency and increased data availability. So you don't have to have all of those to come true, and very clearly a truthful but not accurate set of scenarios. They're not all going to come true. None of them may come true. But the central theme is technology enabling more capacity to see things, and the consumer having more capacity and desire to see those things as you go along. So I think the next decade of your sustainability framework is about dealing with some of those in an environment where there's going to be a lot of disinformation and misinformation in that information space. And I would leave you with two things. One is, you may disagree with all of those scenarios. You may say, no, it's going to happen, or it's going to happen a different way. So as I said at the beginning, what I would like you to do is to go, what are the drivers? What different picture would you see, even if you don't agree with them? So step back and go, what if that did happen? Or what if those drivers put themselves together in a different way? What is the picture I see in that process? And the last thing is a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald, which is the mark of a first-rate mind is to hold two opposing pictures in your mind and still function in the real world. So these things, you should keep some of these possibilities, and others you may create yourselves, and be constantly scanning the forward horizon to go, how's it changing? What's happening? So you can take those drivers and sit around your board table, your kitchen table, and think about what is really happening compared to what I said today, and how is that going to impact on the entirety of our supply chain. So no one interrupted me, so if we've got a little bit of time left, I'll take some questions or arguments now.
Great. Let's start with a round of applause, shall we, for Paul? I think you've set the day up really well by getting us all to stretch our minds and think about what's potentially driving our futures. We do have some time, so there can be questions online. There's a question from Chris.
I think this is turned on. Thanks, Paul. That was quite scary, actually, a fair bit of that. And I'm one of those ageing demographic of dairy farmers that live in when AI was artificial insemination and not what it is these days. And maybe I'm simplistic, but I think the world still has to eat. And somewhere along there, I mean, I don't know whether they have to get hungry before they really value agriculture and dairy, but I don't know whether that's me or not. But it concerns me that we've got, I mean, the misinformation, disinformation is scary, because how will people make the judgment? But hopefully they'll make it with their gut, and they'll feel hungry and they'll eat good, high quality dairy food. Not really a question, is it? But that's a comment, perhaps.
Yeah, as I said, I deliberately sort of tried to stay concentrating on, high value customers that have more choice in those circumstances than large parts of the world don't, because I think they drive your sustainability framework, and it doesn't have to be a huge percentage of those customers as the total industry customers to drive that change, because you've still got to serve that customer and the other customer that's looking for nutrients and lower price product, etc., at the same time. And you can't really chop the industry up in any way that's going to make sense, serving those two groups separately given the demands.
Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Mark Billing. Thanks, Paul. A couple of things. Firstly, intrigued with the Australia, the new Italy concept. My thinking is, are we the next New Zealand? Because we don't have to look very far to see what some of these regulations will have on dairy farmers, and we're seeing it in New Zealand already. So that's the first part. The second part is around the data collection. So I think there's a lot of farms there already. We measure and match genotype individual cows right now. So I think we're actually there. I think the challenge for us now is how do we commercialise that data? So from a dairy farmer perspective, if retailers, if processors want access to that data, how do we commercialise it? How do we actually make that extra bit? Because milk price mightn't do it. Guys, I hope it's going to be better than I think it's going to be next week. But anyway, so probably again, Paul, just comments, but I think in a lot of ways at farm level, we're already there with some of that stuff. It's how now do we actually grab a hold of it and make some cash out of it?
I've got the good news and the bad news. The bad news is better than the good news. Look, I'm just thinking about those things to an extent because I think that the history, history is the best guide in the future in a lot of ways, is that those demands for that information will come down the supply chain, and it's a ticket for playing the game, not an extra layer of profitability. Apart from, you take that Green Atlas example, that's a decision-making tool which has made farmers money on farm, and that's why they adopted it. They didn't adopt it to supply data to the rest of the supply chain. They adopted it because it made sense for them commercially on farm. Now that's, if you think about it, that's a lot simpler example than dairy farming, because you've got one company doing the data collection, doing the analysis, and having that data, as opposed to data in different systems between tractors and sensors and databases with genetic material, etc. So it's more difficult to produce a commercial decision-making tool than that, but I think we will get there. It's going to take a while. So my view will be you'll probably end up with stuff that will help you run your business better, but commercialising the data, I think, is a bit of a pipe dream in my view. So sorry.
Lilith, we have an online question.
Yeah, we've got some online questions. Thanks, Paul. So a few people online are wondering about the fantasy league concept. Is this a way that people can become more engaged with where their food comes from? So some examples that have been put out there is the idea of perhaps you sponsor a cow or a particular farming group, or even can that be extended to ecosystem assets, such as like maybe you sponsor a particular wetland or something like that?
I think there are a myriad of possibilities there. The general point I guess I was trying to make was that you include that plus the automation and stuff, etc. It's just a greater transparency and availability of information. And the reason I put that sort of dairy fantasy league in there is, that generates a lot of interest on top of sport. So I think there's scope for exactly that same thing that happened around agriculture in terms of if people are going to be investing on individual dairy cows, their production numbers, something. There's a lot more interesting about what's happening in that total ecosystem. So that's the reason I think that.
I've got one more question over the back here, and I know lots of people have got their hands up because there's a prize, I know. But we'll just take this question, and then maybe you'll focus the questions to come on the panelists to sit up here. So, Ian?
Well, Ian Sawyer from Feedworks. An observation also on the Fantasy League. That sort of stuff pretty much exists within the poultry sector already. The way chickens are grown in pools. Groups of growers supply steggles or Inghams within that pool. A whole bunch of stuff goes on to manipulate where you sit within that pool, and it has brought on an enormous amount of transparency back from the farm level forward through the entire processing sector through that. So that's actually heaps closer and exists in other sectors already as it sits there. And if we have Coles, as milk processors, it's not inconceivable at all to see something like that could run through an integrated system in the dairy sector. Now, there's heaps of differences around where the assets lie and who owns them and all that sort of thing, but it's already there in terms of that transparency flow through the integrated businesses.
Yeah, there's a science fiction writer of Higgins. Some of you may have seen that report recently on Amazon. He's famous for saying that the future is already here, it's uneven distributed. So, absolutely to be looking at, and it's not about agricultural sectors, other sectors as well, to say what's happening already, how might we adapt that, how long might that take to get to it, and clues, we use that all the time.
That's fantastic. Can we have another round of applause for Paul, please? I think you can tell, Paul, from all these questions that you've really started something. So
I'll be here for until 3 months, so no one is advised for the making. We're going to have one yet, but we have one of the rule folks being informed.
Great, thanks, Paul. And can I have the panelists that are involved in the next session up, please, and also our online connection too. And the idea, everyone in the audience, is to keep the questions coming. So whatever you were thinking about as a question, you might think about whether you're, instead of asking Paul that question, you might ask our new guests some of these questions too. So what I'll do, and I know, Michael, you have one of the hardest jobs because you're online here, but I'd like to particularly welcome you, Michael, from Northern New South Wales. Michael is CEO of Norco Foods. Michael's been involved in the in senior dairy industry positions in different shapes and forms for over 16 years now. So Michael brings a wealth of experience to this conversation. And in particular, Michael, I'm really looking forward to your perspective because you've really, particularly in the last year or two, really seen dairy through a range of different eyes in terms of positioning where dairy fits versus other products in the marketplace. We also have Fiona Davis here next to me. Fiona is CEO of Farmers for Climate Action. And that's a very big organisation for those that haven't heard or seen much of Farmers for Climate Action, over 7,700 members. Anyone who says farmers don't have a strong interest in climate action hasn't heard that number, I reckon, Fiona. So it is a strong farmer-led movement, and it really is an organisation on the front lines of climate change. So welcome, Fiona. Lachlan is next to Fiona. Welcome, Lachlan. Lachlan Monsbourgh is Head of Sustainable Business Development at Rabobank. And I think in topics like this, discussions like this, I think it is more and more important that we actually get a banking perspective. And we also recognise that banks have a really big role and a really big interest in sustainability. So Lachlan really brings that with his role in that, as I said, Head of Sustainable Business Development. Lachlan, you've got an agricultural commerce background, but you've had a range of roles: plantation management, commodity training, corporate sustainability. So great that you're here too with us, Lachlan. And fourth, but definitely not finally, I've got Sandro Demaio, Dr. Sandro Demaio. So a globally renowned public health expert and an advocate. I think advocate with a capital A, Sandro, and a doctor by background. So you can see the diversity that we've got in terms of being able to really talk through some of these issues. You're obviously a very passionate man, food, health, well-being sort of interests in your life. And those interests have taken you all around the world. Those interests have taken you to the World Health Organization and also for a time as CEO of the EAT Foundation. So it's great to have you in Melbourne. Great to have you in your current role as CEO of VicHealth. And I reckon you can bring a lot more to the table than just VicHealth in this conversation too, but I'm sure you're speaking and coming here today as well from a VicHealth perspective. So I might just ask each of the panelists just to say a few words up front, give you guys time to think about questions, what you want to ask of each of the four people with the context of what Paul contributed at the start of the day. So Michael, I might go to you first if you'd like to say a few words off the bat.
Thanks, David, and thanks for having me at this event. And I do apologise not being there in person, but I thought the discussion was very interesting, and certainly a lot of the items that were said are things that we grapple with and certainly have plans in place to address. One of the things I'd say is that we always worry about what the next government regulation is going to be in relation to how it's going to impact our industry and all those kind of things, particularly around sustainability. But I firmly believe that the biggest amount of change is actually going to come from the consumer, and some of the information that Paul sort of highlighted today really does resonate with that, with the changing, political landscape, the rise of teals, the fact that, the two parties are getting less and less of the primary vote, which mean that as consumers' attitudes change and they look for different things, that it's not necessarily going to be the government that will be driving the changes that we'll all have to address, but it will be absolutely consumer-led, which will obviously then change policy. And the conversation about false information, I think every dairy farmer in the room would understand the amount of false information that's put out there by certain movements, which is, something that we will need to address as we move forward. But also just concentrating on the fantastic product that the dairy industry does make. It sustains and creates and grows life. So it is a fantastically nutritious product, which we can't forget, and we need to make sure that we keep telling that story as we move forward. And the other comment that was made around automation and e-commerce, that is something that's here to stay. And as populations get older, more tech savvy, technology comes on. What are the different levels of channels that come out that become available for the dairy industry to move away from the traditional models of bulk export, and also dealing with quite a significant and dominant retail channel in this country? I think there's opportunities there. If we work together and get this right, that we can improve farm returns, because there is value out there the consumers see in the products that our dairy farmers make, and we need to keep capitalising on that and remind them, for some of those that may have forgotten about that value, just exactly the great work that's done, so that we can continue to have a thriving market out there for our farmers' produce.
That's great, Michael, and it's there's a great framing for some of the conversation we're about to have too. So now I'd like to ask Fiona if you'd like to say a few words.
Certainly. Just picking up on the word opportunity there, I think we should be reframing how we think about this. The way they're presented, and I know they're designed to be provocative, is that this is coming at us. How are we going to withstand that? What is that regulatory framework going to look like? And actually, we should be thinking about what's the opportunity here? Like, dairy's doing so much. We're on a trajectory to lower our emissions to, where we can see from the 10-year report there, we're headed in the right direction. What can we do next? Because it kind of doesn't matter in one way what the government looks like. It does, but it doesn't, because the government's going to be responding to what consumers think, as we said before. So we've got to think about questions of social license. Consumers don't want to know every detail of how their food is produced, but they do want to know they can feel good about purchasing it. And there's also market pressures as well. So this isn't just coming in a vacuum. We have international markets, we have companies that need to be, proving they're doing the right thing by the environment. And we also know that, this works in a broader frame. We're on this train. What do we got to do next to stay profitable, to stay like one of the strongest dairy industries in the world? So I think it's a question of opportunity more than fear as we look to the future.
Well said, Fiona. It's fantastic that perspective and that strength in terms of how important the consumer is, isn't it? Always focused on that. Lachlan, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, thanks everyone. And I'd actually like to take my hat off to Paul, because we as financial services industry are probably in banking agri are really concerned about the liberalisation or the lack of liberalisation of farm data, right? Because in the age of misinformation, in the age of disinformation, the only thing that actually is going to stand you in good stead is the quantification of your footprint on farm, right? And if we don't address this unilaterally, whether it be through the financial industry, the agri-input industry, farms themselves, we're probably more at risk to that disinformation, right? Because we don't actually have a coherent set of numbers that we can go back and basically and sit on. So I think, yeah, Paul, thank you very much for just throwing it out there in terms of what's happening, because if all industries in ag, this isn't just dairy, if we don't sort of focus on this, I think in the next 5 years, to basically use numbers to build that story, we're going to be in big trouble. It's basically like, if you think the ATO and the national budget and the Treasury not being able to fall back on a set of numbers, how that would look like. It wouldn't look good, right? So we need to do that from an environmental point of view as well.
Great, thanks, Lachlan. And Sandro?
Yeah, I would echo the comments around. So first of all, just a thought. I mean, it's interesting that we're talking about, I work in policy, and it's interesting that we're talking about sort of risk of government and policy rather than the opportunity, but also at the end of the day, your consumers are your voters. They're not two different groups of people, they are the same. So if your voters are shifting, and largely that's a generational shift, let's be honest, as the millennial generation comes through, their voting patterns, their priorities, and the way they purchase and behave are all changing significantly. And so in a way, it's not something to be feared as so much where do the opportunities lie. And for, you know, a country that produces some of the highest quality and most sustainable produce in the world, it has to be an opportunity, but it has to be taken in a global context. So I come from a health perspective, so I have a slightly different frame through which I kind of see the world. But if we look at the major megatrends in nutrition and food systems and policy, so prior to the pandemic, it was really about convergence, confusion, and convenience. So there was this convergence of multiple sectors of policy that never talked to each other. And it was my job at the World Health Organization to try and get them all in the same room, which actually was incredibly difficult. And it reminds me again today, because we actually speak a completely different language. If I was in a room full of health-focused food systems people, this meeting would look very different. The words we would use would be very different. And I don't recognize anyone in this room. And I very rarely go to a meeting where I don't recognize anyone. So the trend was around convergence. It really saw it take off with the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, this massive commitment to convergence in sustainability. It's probably also why the word suddenly ticked up through Agenda 2030 and the global commitment, including of our government to sustainable development. We saw the kind of converging of agriculture, nutrition, food, as well as undernutrition and obesity. I was working with the Indonesian government for many years. 30% of adult women are obese or overweight and anemic, and yet 30% of children are facing long-term hunger. Very complex, difficult nutrition environment, far more difficult to respond to as a policymaker. So that was convergence, and it really came to a head with the Food Systems Summit at the United Nations General Assembly that was led by heads of nations in 2021. The second is obviously around confusion. We've talked about that confusion of the public, misinformation, even confusion around what is healthy and what is not. Food literacy continues to be a huge issue in Australia, and health literacy with it. You know, even just the enormous amount of difference within things like you know, dairy and dairy production, and you know, it continues to be a very kind of naive conversation largely, and certainly from the health side, I think we have a lot to learn as well. And the last is obviously convenience. You know, we saw consumers wanting more convenient. Everyone's, you know, multiple adults in the workforce in the same household. Different pressures on lives as generations are shifting, rising cost of housing. All of these things are flowing through to what we put on our plate and how we consume it, even how we buy it. During the pandemic, it was largely disruption and acceleration. So many of the big challenges we faced pre-pandemic simply got worse faster. And where we're at now is a little bit of an unclear picture, but certainly we're seeing a picture more of divergence. So we're seeing wealthy households enjoy probably the same trajectory we were on before, worried about sustainability, about you know, where our food comes from, engaging with the food system, buying highest quality food. But large segments of the population are food insecure. We've seen a doubling of food insecurity in Victoria over the last few years. People who have never faced food insecurity being food insecure for the first time. And what this is meaning on the plate at the checkout is that people are making really tough choices. So instead of red meat, they're buying white meat. They're thinking about how much dairy they buy, and they're buying less fruit and vegetables and more processed foods. And all of these things are going to have flow-on effects for our regional communities, for our production communities and our farmers who continue to face poorer health outcomes than most across the country, but also for health equity and lower income families.
Great, Sandro. It's I think there's a lot of really important reminders in what you just said, because and what everyone has said, because what you really see with 4 people up here with myself is people coming at this from different angles, but with quite similar challenges and quite, and I think that's the whole epitome of the sustainability framework. It's an inclusive framework that needs to think about all these elements, has to think about the whole supply chain, and ultimately has to think about the ultimate consumer of dairy. So I know there was people looking to ask questions earlier. Rather than me asking questions off the bat, is there anyone who'd like to ask the question that they had on their mind? Paul, you've got your hand up, and Louise, you've got a hand up. If I can just introduce who you are and nominate who you want to ask the question to first, and then I might ask any of the other panelists to contribute to the answer as well.
Paul Wood, former director on the Dairy Australia Board. So my question's for Michael. Michael, you guys have made an investment in the future with your relationship with Eden Brew and looking at precision fermentation. What's the drivers for that sort of investment from your point of view?
I think in any business, you need to make products that consumers want to buy, and there is an element of the market out there that is moving away from dairy products for reasons that we probably all don't necessarily agree with. There's an addressable market out there that our product doesn't meet that particular market, and it's growing, and there's value in it. So we saw that investment as a way to get in as a carry-free interest in an organisation, a 25% carry-free interest, to see whether or not there was value that we could create for our members. And it's interesting. I mean, as we sort of move 2 years on from that company, Eden Brew's got a valuation at the moment of $85 million. When we started, had a valuation of $1, and we're a 25% shareholder. So we see that as, the rest of our business also, and certainly our strategy is to have businesses outside of dairy that are able to make money and magnify the returns that we're able to provide back to our dairy farmers. Whether that's our rural stores, our stock feed business, or our grain trading, etc., even our ice cream business, we would see Eden Brew as another value creation vehicle that we could create some significant value for our dairy farmers. So if you think about what that's worth, we probably have a $20 million asset that we paid $1 for. So, to us, it's, again, about making money for our dairy farmers and making them more sustainable.
Great. Thanks, Michael. We have a microphone and a question waiting anyway over. I know I saw some people with their hands up. And Lilith, while this is happening, is there anyone online with a question that you'd like to? Nothing at the moment? Okay. Ian, you had your hand up earlier.
Ian Morris, I'm a dairy farmer and economist. I think we've been challenged very well on issues from the consumers and for voters, perspective. I don't have any, but following on from Paul's comment, fermentation, to what extent is that a challenge to dairy farming per se in the long run, given the investments that are going on in the US and others? To what extent is it a challenge to the whole industry? That's obviously a very long-term issue, but it's albeit very important, I think, in the context of a discussion of mega trends that could affect the industry.
Are you posing that to Michael first and foremost?
Well, it's really to everyone. I mean,
sure.
And to the room.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of people with an opinion about the question. Maybe if we give Michael, if that's a question you've never been asked before, I expect. So,
look, I think over our history we've seen disruptive technology come into to many different markets and segments, and some of that technology has been very successful, and some of that technology has not been successful, and some of that technology has been quite complementary. You know, precision fermentation, you know, certainly is an opportunity for value creation, as we see it. But I honestly do believe that there will and always will be an absolutely strong market for fresh farm milk in this country. I have no doubt there'll be parts of the community as we get, you know, further and further and further down the track that'll have different consumer preferences and different consumer choice mechanisms that we can either choose to address or not address. You know, certainly our strategy is that, you know, how can we address some of those preferences into the future and make sure that our members are able to, you know, get some significant value out of it. It will be the case in the future that precision fermentation will, as it comes on in significant scale, you know, will be a reasonably cheap form of protein. But that doesn't mean to say that the product would be cheap. I think there's certainly you know, a hell of a lot of investment that needs to go into precision fermentation in terms of capital. Some of these factories might be $1 billion to set up to do, you know, 150 million or 200 million litres of say milk equivalent. So there's significant capital will need to go in and significant returns that will be needed to be able to be made for that industry to remain relevant. And no difference to dairy. I mean, I think all the dairy farmers in the room would sit there with, you know, their farms that 10 years ago might have been worth $2 million, but now they're worth 10, sitting there thinking, well, we need to make the dairy industry more profitable and more sustainable for the farmer themselves. And that's certainly what I think we're all attempting to do in relation to make those returns better. And we see as, you know, precision fermentation and indeed the creation of $20 million of value is something how we can do that also.
Thanks, Michael. I'm just really mindful that we're at a sustainability framework meeting and not a alternate milks meeting. So I really want to give people a chance. A lot of us have a small opinion. Some of us have a big opinion about the topic. I just want to give us a chance to move on to other topics around the sustainability framework, given we've got, you know, health, banking, farmers for climate change sort of people here to ask questions of. So, John.
Thanks, David. John Penry from Dairy Australia. I think this one's for Fiona, and it's off the back of the commentary around increased information points on dairy farms. So the question is, give us a view of the future. When do you think consumers are going to be expecting to have a statement around the environmental footprint of what they're about to buy off the supermarket shelf actually put on the packaging?
Well, I wish I had a precise answer for you there, and probably out of both for doing research in that space. But what I would say is that kind of traceability is coming into consumers, as I understand it, increasingly important for that kind of information. So I think when we think about it from the dairy perspective, we want to be kind of on the front foot when that's happening. As I understand it, when farmers are applying for finance, then you know provisions from the banking sector about what, you know, do you have a biodiversity plan? Do you have a carbon neutral plan? So there's a structure there that's going to be filled out in the next few years. And I'd probably throw it to you. Do you have anything to add to that?
I think the key thing, and I sort of harp back to my introduction, we've got to get standardised sets of figures, which we haven't got in agriculture for representing it yet. And until we sort of dodge around that, we're probably, we'll be at the disposal of marketers who want to just make product claims, and then you get into the risk of greenwashing, right? So unless we get something like you see in Sandro's world, like the health guidelines, how much sugar, how much carbs, how much everything is on the back of your packet, unless we get a standardized set of figures that we can all agree on, where it will be just I guess in the realm of product marketing, which I think has got risk, significant risk.
I would just add, I mean, there are countries now that are trialing integrated front of pack labelling, for example, that combine environment and health into single frameworks. So we have the Health Star rating here in Australia. You would have seen it on the front of packs. It's not compulsory, but the dairy industry do very well at using it as it's intended, because I think it works, in the favour of high quality, healthy dairy. There are countries now trialling combined front of pack labelling, sort of traffic light style warnings. Again, they should really work in the favour of a sustainable, healthy industry. And I think those conversations are certainly of more interest to new governments here in Australia than they have been over the last decade. I think the opportunity, the question then should be, what's the opportunity, and how do you make it an opportunity for the sector and for farmers here in Australia? Because I think it can be a good news story and not something necessarily to be feared, and then be involved in shaping that in a way that's also helpful and appropriate.
Michael, do you have anything have you got any experience about trends in your business for ending up with labelling or?
So I think it's interesting. I go back to the other comments that are made. I think we'd need to have a fairly standardised approach. I think the way we look at it also is that we're very conscious, being 100% farmer owned, and we're very trusted by our consumers not to come out with something unless it's absolutely robust, auditable, etc. Because I don't think, and certainly for our business, but I don't think for the industry either, that we want to come out with anything that can then be subject to challenge, because that will then just give those groups an opportunity to say that we're not doing the right thing. But just on one of the other comments, David, if you don't mind, there's in the original opening comments, there was the thing about opportunity. I still think there's great opportunity here for dairy farmers in relation to adopting sustainable practice changes. I mean, we're looking at a whole range of things at the moment. Obviously on farm, electricity and diesel are two big carbon emitters, and how can we take it? And labour is a major challenge. How can we have provide dairy farmers access to things that to use on their farm, so that they don't have to use diesel or they don't need labour, and that's autonomous drones and all those kind of bits and pieces. And I think whilst they're technologies that are still developing, we certainly see those as items that will be in our portfolio of support measures for our members as we move forward to help them have lower carbon footprint in their farming operations as well. And I think that's exciting, because I'm sure every dairy farmer would like a 5 cent increase, the 5 cent per litre increase in milk, but just the same, I think they'd like to have a 5 cent reduction in their cost on farm, because it means exactly the same. And that's the opportunity framework that we need to look at, how we can get sustainability for the farmer so that they make more money, because they need to make more money.
That's great. Thanks, Michael. And you got the microphone.
Yeah, David Pattonbridge, BridgeLogic. I'm not quite sure if this is questions too, but it's driven by both a comment by Fiona and from Lachlan, and it's about information. So largely it seems like what we're really talking about this morning as the theme which Paul introduced was how we manage information. And one of the major challenges here is the question you posed: how do we know what's driving a social license? So how do we actually pick out of that, how do we interpret that and translate that into a clear message that's going to land most favourably for what the dairy industry wants to meet a consumer position? But at the same time, we're managing the viability of dairy farms that are complex operations that need access to information that is important for what they know is important. For instance, issues like land management, which are much more important to farmers than necessarily consumers. So we've got this really big balancing act here of how we deal with this complexity of data to meet different audiences. And at the moment, we put it together in one book, which is fantastic. But really the essence of this is that messaging has a strong capacity, I think, to get lost, I would have thought, unless there's more differentiation that's really landing in the right spot. And I'm just wondering, how do we do that? What's our approach to that?
Well, it's a big question, Patton. I reckon integrity is central here. Integrity is what is done on that, what we say publicly, and the figures that we're using. In this age of potential misinformation, we can't afford to be making claims that are seen to be untrue. And we see this as well when we think about the varying market opportunities around carbon market and biodiversity markets. We need to know there's integrity to be able to have real credibility there. And I think although there's different levels of information we need to think about here, what consumers want, I don't think is that complex. They just want to know that it's the right thing that's being done. So I think you've got to think about, take a kind of step back and look at what is happening. And I think if it passes the pub test, you're probably going to be pretty okay. If you're meeting that general standard. And I think we know generally, if we're listening and reading widely, we have a gut feel for what that is. And consumers will speak up and voters will speak up. And that's what we see. That's what we've been talking about, this potential, are we the new Italy, which I think we're a very different political system. I'm no expert on Italy. But I think what we've been seeing is that some of the major parties have been out of step with what consumers, with what voters are looking for. And I don't think it's a complex message. But we also, on the farm side, we do need to be looking at baselines. How do we support farmers to look at the baseline of where they are at? How do they get the tools to know what they can do next? And I think that is a complex space. And I think there's a real opportunity there to get governments getting the right policies in place, get the right investments in place to support that.
Yeah, I think I picked up in your question, Patton, sort of how do I prioritise, right, in terms of what's there, what bits do I have to chew off? We've done a bit of research sort of saying, right, all the major fast-moving consumer good brands, what are they focusing on? Their emissions, animal health, soil, water, and biodiversity. So they're the big five. Now, being in a mature market, if you were dairy farming in Kenya, there'd be labour issues there as well. There'd be human rights issues as well. So they're the big five. And I think if you sort of step down from sort of international frameworks like the Paris Climate Accord, right through to what our government's committed to now, relatively secure bipartisan support on emissions. I think if you're not working on that, you're going to be at a market disadvantage and maybe even a regulatory disadvantage, as Paul mentioned earlier, in the future. So that would, for me, be in terms of how you're thinking about this from a priority. All right, where do I spend whatever available money I've got into this outside of production cost? They would be the five themes that we sort of see are just prevalent and the now. Yeah.
Great. I think over the back here, we've got a question.
Thank you. Ash Cooper from New South Wales Farmers. So please indulge me. This is more from a very recent personal experience, but to the sustainability framework and those we have in the room, very much agree with the need to continually be looking forwards to the future and picking up your point, Michael, around, boosting sustainability on farm, et cetera. But I wanted to sort of touch on the social license and Lachlan, pardon me, your points around, what the banks need in terms of data. And Sandro, you've sort of spoken to the consumer behaviour changes, as you have as well, Fiona, and sort of the focus on that instead of government. In terms of the here and now and beyond the farm gate, my question is, are we doing enough as an industry, agriculture, to support documents like the sustainability framework, and are we promoting them enough? And I ask that because my personal banking app the other day, apart from telling me how terrible my spending's been this month, told me how terrible I am as a person because of my carbon footprint, and I need to stop consuming livestock products for at least 2 days a week to reduce my carbon footprint. So for all the banks in the room that have agribusiness sectors, what are you doing with this document and all the other ones to override that so that the consumer challenges we're facing in terms of their social license and sentiment isn't blocking the ability of documents such as this to progress industry and what we're standing for?
Change your bank.
Yes, so my bank said that I'd change it.
Yeah. While the other more expert people on the panel gather their thoughts, I can provide two reflections. One is, I mean, and I don't say this as VicHealth, but I say this more personally. I think it's also, we're worried about the change in voting and the maybe move away from a two-party system. But it does strike me as strange that, you know, in a world where there are polarized views in regulation and you flop back and forth every 3 years, that's a very difficult environment to do good business and to commit long-term to structural change to deliver a sustainable food system and a healthy population. Some level of compromise and consistency might not be a bad thing. I don't know. I'm just, you know, reflecting as a voter, not as a bureaucrat. I think from the banking perspective, you know, that brings, for me, we don't have a national strategy around our food system. We're a major food producer. Most of the story around the food we produce is a good news story. I worked at the United Nations for 4 years. There are countries in the world who probably have a lot more to be worried about in terms of the globalization and interdependency that we need in our food systems to achieve a healthy 2050 world and reduce inequality and hunger. Australia will largely be a very good news story for our farmers and for our producers. I don't think we understand that enough. I don't think our politicians necessarily understand that enough. I don't think the consumers do. But part of that is because we have these fragmented conversations. We're talking in the health space, but we don't talk to the ag community, the communities worried about food security don't talk to the communities even talking about diabetes and heart disease and chronic conditions that kill 9 in 10 Australians, you know, in terms of cause of death, not the current population. So, you know, I think we need to have a national conversation about what is our plan, a proper, mature, you know, manage the conflicts, maximize the alignment, look at the co-benefits, and really the opportunities of how do we achieve that sustainability and health and prosperity, you know, in a more connected way. So we're not telling consumers to do one thing for one thing and then another for another, and causing more confusion.
Yeah, I think, sorry, and I'm going to sound like a complete broken record here. How the bank, I'll go to that central theme, how the bank has got that data is just by taking a national inventory emissions intensity and saying, right, this is where you're at. Now, we all know in this room, in a group of dairy farmers, there'll be probably a 40 to 50% divergence in the emissions intensity from one producer to the next, depending on their production system. This is where, if we don't have that data, this becomes dangerous, because in the world of being cancelled, right? These are some of the, I guess, very, very simplistic assumptions that either corporations, consumer groups, voters can make based on very broad industry averages, which have a high degree of error in them anyway. So yeah, that's my comment.
Really picked up in part of that question was are we doing enough? And I guess to be provocative in this space, I think we can do a lot more than what we're doing. I think the nature of sustainability frameworks are that it's got to be a bit of a base, what folks are agreeing to, where we're at. But I'd love to see us, I guess, approach this with optimism and enthusiasm and seeing that opportunity there. Like, what can we be? What kind of future can we be excited about being? And I think as we kind of raise our targets, our kind of a vision of where we want to be, consumers will come with us on that journey. And you know, by retaining our integrity and our ambition and actually achieving those goals, getting those policies in place that we need to be able to meet them, we start to kind of putting facts on the table. You've got that name that people will agree to. You've got a great case to be making those kind of health or environmental kind of arguments. But I think, so I think there's so much more that can be done.
Thanks, Fiona. I think we've got an online question to the next.
We've actually got a few. I am conscious of time, so I'll try and be really quick. All right, we'll go one. So Fiona, this one is for you. It's from Didi Woodside. She's wondering about a new federal bill on nature recovery that's coming out. She's interested to know whether this is something that can actually provide opportunities for farmers in both the near and longer term future.
I'm so happy about this question. We are putting a submission next week to the Senate inquiry into nature fair market bill. It's something we've been looking really carefully at. I spoke to Professor Richard Eckard from Melbourne Uni on our podcast recently, and he talked about a vision for 2030 where the focus is biodiversity with the carbon payload. And I think there's really exciting possibilities. And I think if we can make all market work, that's fantastic. I think there's a danger in using offsets. We cannot have more destruction of the nature that we have right now. And the other question is integrity. So we need farmers to know there's integrity getting into this, and we need investors to know there's integrity as well. We put out a survey to our farmers. So we've got about 7,800 farmers at the moment. So we sent out our survey. In 3 days, I got over 400 responses. About 60-something% said yes, based on what they knew, they'd be part of a market like that. But integrity was a question there for both. And there was another percentage, I think about 20 to 30% that they're unsure. So, we don't know that much more. So I think there's a real opportunity there, but we've got to get it right. Or there could be really perverse outcomes.
Thanks, Fiona. I know for those of you that are feeling a bit caffeine deficient, we're going a little bit over. We'll take 2 more questions, one from Melissa and one from Stephen, and then we'll wrap up the session. So, Melissa.
Thanks, David. Melissa Cameron from Dairy Australia, Human Health Nutrition Policy Manager. My question's to Sandro. And you touched earlier on the fact that the language in the room is different, the stakeholders, you don't know the people in the room. And then you sort of talked about government and that lack of leadership for that national policy. How do you think we can actually foster those true collaborative, relationships with, farmers, producers, processors, and public health to deliver real change and actually be that leadership? Too much, I think it seems like us, them, or, us and you guys, and I come from a 20-year public health background. So I just think there's a real opportunity here for us to really get those collaborative relationships to actually deliver change and be that leadership.
Yeah, I would agree. So my previous job was running a global foundation based out of Northern Europe that brought together science policy, politicians and business leaders, 1,000 of them in the food system space every year, and really tried to foster that sort of mature, safe place to be able to have really difficult conversations, because they are really difficult conversations. We're talking about, conflicts of interest, mistrust, but there's also a lot of alignment and opportunity, and far more actually opportunity than misalignment as you get to talk with people. I do think that we need, here in Victoria and across Australia, we need a joined up strategy when it comes to our food system and when it comes to nutrition. We don't have a national nutrition strategy. We don't have a food system strategy. So, asking the question, how does Australia deliver a 2050 food system with a planet that's healthier than we found it, and a population not only here but across the region, because we have a responsibility as a food bowl and as a country that makes a lot of money from exporting food, to make, what is our kind of bilateral and multilateral responsibilities as well. I think if the government decided to do that, like they're doing, for example, at the moment, the early years strategy, bringing together different stakeholders, a range of different departments and different sectors through consultation to develop a joined up plan, I think that would be a huge step forward for the country and for the state. It's certainly possible. And if you look at, the overlap between these sorts of conversation and even the measuring what matters component of the budget this year, there are lots of parts that people won't agree on, and maybe politics itself as well, obviously. But the idea that we're looking beyond just price to broader measures of prosperity outside of GDP for health, for the nation, and for our land and our natural resources, there's a lot of overlap there in the types of conversations we need to have around our food system. So I think the time is right. Well, it's overdue, 20 years overdue, but better now than never. And I think it needs to come through a joined up national strategy where we purposefully bring these different sectors, the different departments and the different parts, leaders of society for one proper conversation.
Great. And Stephen?
Stephen Sheridan from Australian Dairy Farmers. Firstly, thanks to all the speakers. I think we've had a lot of conversation around the issue, certainly why we're here today. And I was thinking about it, and we've talked about the changing landscape, the changing population, changing consumer landscape. We're certainly seeing government response. We're seeing political regulatory response, not only here, but in Australia. There was an interesting article in Farm Online today about potential changes in with the Dutch government looking to close down dairy farms. So you've got that political response. We're also looking at the commercial retail responses, retailers, and as Ash pointed out, banks sending, well, to meet their ESG targets, if you like, sending signals through to consumers, but also to the dairy producer. From my perspective, working with farmers, it's how do the farmers respond to all these signals? You've got government, regulatory, political signals, as well as commercial signals from retailers. Those retailers trying to meet their targets. How does the farmer on the ground, and it may not be a question we can answer in this panel, it may be a question for the day, but how do we set up the right environment for the farmer to respond, whether it's capturing data, trading data, knowing what their carbon footprint is, etc. So a general question to the panel, but I've enjoyed the discussion. Thank you.
I think that we think about what the farmer needs to do this. I just wanted to add, we've been talking about responding to market signals and what consumers are, looking for. We've also got the reality that climate change is here now. So from the environmental perspective, farmers need support to adapt and mitigate climate change on farm to be able to continue producing the food that they do. We've been calling off, we put out a report called Farming Forever, looking at what farmers need from a national climate change and ag plans. We don't have one of those for agriculture either. And one of the overwhelming things that came out of that was farmers want face-to-face support. They want extension officers to be able to help them know what to take the next step. So they want to do more, but they need so much more from government and broader services to be able to do that. And so we were really happy to see an investment in extension officers in the most recent budget, but we still see a need to be able to scale that up because farmers are looking for these tools and they do need them now to start adapting and mitigating.
Yeah, I think one of the key things in that is just an understanding of where I would say the average farm is, irrespective of whether it be dairy or the other commodities. I think most farmers aren't at a scale yet where collecting data for the sake of collecting data is normal, right? And it just because of scale issues, because farmers are still on the tools, and we have to work out as industry how that can be automated or something like that, because the burden of that will be probably too much if we want, let's say, a corporate approach to it, and something that maybe a fund could use, or somebody with, let's say, 50 plus staff. They've got the economies of scale to be able to manage that data. It's something we really have to approach and look at seriously, because we're just the average farm is just not quite yet at that scale to incorporate that in their business.
Could I make a comment, David?
Yeah, go for it, Michael.
I think if we wait for everything that we think that we need before we do something, I think we would have waited too long. I mean, there's some good calculators at the moment that Dairy Australia have put together, which are certainly a great starting point. Actually, they're better than a great. They're very, very good starting point. But as we look at our farms, all the things that we've been doing over the last, however many years in terms of managing the land and water and those kind of things, if we're looking at carbon, we just need to have a look at what investments that we would look to make to reduce the amount of carbon that we emit. And it forget about the animals for the moment, because I'm sure there'll be a solve for methane, but most of those are in and around electricity, and they're around the consumption of diesel. If we're thinking, and we know that we're going to have to be 50% reduced and at some point in time, net zero carbon. So we know that those two items in their own are going to be big focus points, obviously animals as well, but in terms of the consumption of resource, those two items are going to be fairly significant items. So investments that reduce the cost on farm of diesel, that reduce the cost on farm of electricity, are certainly going to be in absolutely the right direction. So we can probably start doing some of that stuff today. And indeed, many farmers are, and we've just got to make sure that we're telling that story, because we're already doing some amazing things. We just probably need to do a few more and have that more widespread across the industry. So then be able to call that out to consumers so that they know that we're doing a bloody good job.
I reckon that's a great call, Michael. And look, I think we've had fantastic panelists, a fantastic discussion. What I'm really enjoying is us all being in person, having these discussions now after a few years not being able to, how energised everyone is, how many great questions there are. But we're going to go into round tables after morning tea, and I think it's only fair that we get a final thought from our panelists. Sandro, you started this by saying you can really see this food insecurity and this growing challenge that we've got, as well as all the good news stories of us being great food producers. What's your final thought to the group that's about to work after morning tea that you want to leave them with?
I think, first of all, the major trends that we've seen for the last sort of 5 years haven't gone away. People are still worried about the climate. They're worried about their kids' future. They're worried about, the how we balance, the life we want to have now, but also, and being healthy, because we're actually not a very healthy nation, with handing on a planet that's better than we found it. At the moment, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, people are facing incredibly difficult times. Unemployment's probably about to start going up, and people are focused on, getting food into their cupboards and on the plates. But those big trends that we've seen, the shift in consumer priorities and behaviours is not going away. So, continuing to do what this sector does very well, feed Australians and keep us well nourished, obviously important even as we think about responding to some of the health threats now and into the future. The other part is that just keep let's have more of a conversation between my world and this world, because there is so much alignment in what we're trying to achieve. And I think we can be much stronger in our voice to government, but also in our voice to consumers. If you look at what is a sustainable diet, what is a healthy diet, and what Australia produces, there's a huge amount of overlap. And I've never met a farmer in my life. I travel a lot through regional Victoria, never met a farmer who doesn't want to be part of driving a healthy future for Australians. So looking for more opportunities to connect those dots and have more conversations.
That's great. Thank you, Sandro. And Lachlan, you have a world of your own in banking. Do you want to leave us a final thought from your perspective?
Oh, I hope it's not too far out on a limb. Look, I think what we've seen in the Australian environment is a real change of mood in terms of being able to have this conversation objectively, and to Patton's question, all right, what do I need? I'm a farmer. What do I need to do now? We're ready for that conversation. And service providers, we're one of many service providers, just have to get on the page in terms of, okay, how can we be a facilitator to those needs? Is it in the incentivisation of products? Is it in education? Is it in networking opportunities like this? We're as an organisation every day, I guess, challenging ourselves. How do we make sure we're front and centre to those conversations, so that clients, farmers can continue to develop in this space.
Great, thanks, Lachlan. Fiona.
We've talked here, we've talked fairly broadly around sustainability and the dairy industry. I've talked about the need to be ambitious, to be optimistic, to step into this rather than to kind of be frightened by what's coming. So I would encourage everyone to approach today with optimism. I'd also just broaden this out a little to say that agriculture is doing a lot to reduce its emissions. There's so much potential there. But also don't forget that farmers are one of the most trusted spokespeople on climate change. And this is not about ag, just ag. The rest of the economy in Australia needs to be reducing its emissions to tackle the key drivers of climate change. And this is looking at sustainability from an environmental perspective. So let's also keep our voices in the national conversation. There's low-hanging fruit in energy and transport. This has benefits for ag as well, but it has benefits for tackling climate change. So let's do what we can and make sure that the rest of the economy is following.
That's great and very inspirational, and leaves a really big onus on you, Michael, to go from there with some final words.
Oh, look, I'd say we're in an environment of change, and I think farming's been in an environment of change for a long time, and it's even season to season. What we've been able to see is that as we've been able to concentrate on items which we call sustainability, or the world out there calls sustainability, we've been able to save significant money. We've taken millions of dollars out of our freight costs, of being able to change and have the mindset of reducing our inputs first. And I would encourage all farmers in the room to sit there and have a look at this positively, because there's a big chance that the first half a dozen or dozen things that you do on your farm will have significant changes to your profitability for the better. It won't just be, oh, this is going to cost me money, or this is going to be a major problem. There may be costs that come into the future as we get to the last pieces. Yes, that's a possibility. But if we've made the inroads over the next year or two to reduce our input costs on farm and do things differently, concentrating on reduction of use of items, particularly around the carbon space, the diesel and electricity, we would have been able to make some savings that will be able to help shelter us from whatever costs they are into the future. And I'm sure that certainly Norco will, and I'm sure all the other processors will be looking to help and support farmers through this process, because you're a key part of the supply chain. That's where it all starts. You're incredibly valued, and above all, the consumer values what we do, and we do have to work out what the right story is. That story will be certainly assisted by works that all the farmers in the country, or the dairy farmers, do in terms of being able to reduce some of their emissions over time. But let's make sure we do those reductions where we save a lot of money first, and we'll worry about the things in the future, because that could potentially change. But don't be scared of it. It'll we've certainly found that we've been able to save millions of dollars in our organisation by concentrating on being much more efficient with the things that we do, and concentrating on those two items of diesel and electricity.
That's great, Michael. So we'll break for morning tea now. But before we do, I'd just like everyone to give a appreciation and a round of applause for Michael, Fiona, Lachlan, Sandro, and Paul. Been fantastic. Thank you.